I don't care what that little screen says. She does not belong in this cabin." The words landed like a slap across the hushed, climate-controlled air of the first-class cabin, sharp enough that the woman in 3A actually flinched behind her magazine, and the young flight attendant near the galley curtain went completely visibly still. The man who had spoken them was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit the color of winter clouds. His platinum blonde hair swept back with the kind of precision that suggested he paid someone to make it look effortless. He was standing in the aisle of Atlantic Transatlantic Flight 94, one hand resting on the back of seat 2A with the casual ownership of a man who had never once in his adult life been told that something did not belong to him. The woman he was speaking about had not moved. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze directed out the oval window toward the gray tarmac of JFK, her expression carrying the particular practiced stillness of someone who had learned a very long time ago that the first reaction is rarely the right one. She had not raised her voice. She had not turned to look at him. She simply existed in that seat quietly and completely, as though the storm building around her was happening in another dimension entirely. What the man did not know, what almost no one on that aircraft understood yet, was that 4 hours earlier, a little girl 7 years old had stopped being able to feel her legs, and that the woman sitting at the center of his fury was the only reason anyone believed that might one day change. And in the cockpit, a captain had just read something on his screen that made him set down his coffee very slowly and stand up. The alarm on Naomi Reeves's phone was set for 4:15 in the morning, but she was already awake when it went off. Sitting at the small kitchen table in her Rochester apartment, with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone mostly cold, staring at nothing in particular, while the refrigerator hummed its low, indifferent hum in the corner of the room. She had been a pediatric neurosurgeon for 14 years, and she had learned in the first 3 of those years that sleep before a difficult case was something you scheduled and negotiated with your body, like a business arrangement, sometimes honored and sometimes not. The night before a transatlantic emergency call was firmly in the not category. She had lain on her bed, fully dressed for 2 hours before giving up entirely and moving to the kitchen, where at least the light was honest. The apartment was small by the standards of what a surgeon at her level could theoretically afford, but Naomi had never been particularly interested in the architecture of status. There were books on every flat surface, a whiteboard covered in anatomical diagrams near the window, and on the refrigerator door held by a magnet shaped like a Minnesota loon, a photograph of a woman in a pale blue nursing uniform standing outside a brick building squinting into the sun. Her mother, Claudette, 32 years old, in the picture caught between shifts at the community hospital in Baltimore, where she had worked 6 nights a week for the better part of 2 decades. Naomi had taken the photo herself when she was 9 with a disposable camera she'd gotten for her birthday, and she had carried some version of it with her ever since, through college, through medical school, through residency, in rooms so small she had to turn sideways to get past the bed because her mother's face in that picture was the face of someone who had already decided long before the deciding got easy what kind of person she was going to be. "You don't need them to believe in you, baby," Claudette had told her once, standing in the kitchen of their Baltimore row house while Naomi, 16, and furious after a guidance counselor had suggested she consider vocational training instead of pre-med, sat at that same kitchen table doing what she was doing now, staring at nothing and trying to talk herself down from the ceiling. "You just need you to know who you are. The rest catches up eventually." The rest had caught up. Eventually was the right word for it. Slow, incremental, hard one, but it had arrived. At 41, Naomi Reeves was one of perhaps 8 surgeons in the world who could perform a complete posterior cervical decompression on a pediatric patient with a C1 to C2 fracture and a meaningful statistical chance of preserving motor function. She had published 4 papers on modified stabilization techniques for children under 10. 2 hospitals in Japan had used her protocols to train their entire pediatric spine units. She did not mention any of this at dinner parties, partly because she rarely attended dinner parties, and partly because she had grown up in a world where the people who most needed to know your credentials were also the people most determined not to ask. Her phone had rung at 3:40 a.m., 40 minutes before the alarm. An unfamiliar London number, and she almost let it go to voicemail almost, but something in the pattern of the ring, or maybe just the particular quality of the darkness at 3:40 on a Tuesday, made her pick up. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Dr. Alistair Webb, Chief of Pediatric Trauma at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and it was the voice of someone who had been awake for 20 hours and had run out of professional composure about 4 hours earlier. He spoke quickly, over-explaining, and then catching himself and starting over. And what emerged from the tangle of his words was this. A 7-year-old girl named Iris had been thrown from a horse the previous afternoon at a riding lesson in Surrey, and the fall had done something to her cervical spine that 3 different specialists at 2 different London hospitals had looked at and agreed was beyond what they could safely touch. The imaging showed a complex fracture pattern with progressive cord compression. She had some movement in her arms. She had none in her legs. The window for surgical intervention that might change that picture was narrowing with every hour they waited. Webb had been given Naomi's name by 2 people independently in the same conversation, and he was calling at 3:40 in the morning because there was no version of this situation in which it was appropriate to wait until business hours. Naomi sat with the phone against her ear and listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Webb finished, she was quiet for exactly 10 seconds. She could feel them passing one by one, and then she asked 3 questions about the imaging, listened to the answers, and said, "I'll be on the first available flight. Have the OR scheduled for tomorrow evening London time. I'll review the full imaging on the plane." She hung up, sat still for a moment longer, and then pulled her carry-on bag out from under the bed and began to pack. At the check-in counter at JFK, 3 hours later, the agent, a young man, early 20s, name tag reading Paul, looked at her boarding pass. Looked at her, and then looked at the boarding pass again, with the particular micro-expression that Naomi had catalogued so many times over the years. She could have drawn it from memory, the small recalibration, the momentary loading screen pause while a person's assumption rebooted against an inconvenient reality. She was wearing a charcoal cashmere sweater, dark jeans, and her hair pulled back. She was carrying a tote bag and a laptop case. She looked by the specific and narrow visual vocabulary that Paul had apparently been handed like someone who did not buy $9,000 transatlantic first-class tickets. He handed her the boarding pass without saying anything extra. She took it without explaining anything extra. She had stopped explaining a long time ago. Her mother had been right about that too. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Flight 94 was only half full when Naomi boarded, which meant the space had that particular quality of expensive quiet, the kind that came not from silence exactly, but from distance from the architecture of privacy that separated each seat from the next, with enough leather and polished wood paneling to make the rest of the world feel theoretical. Naomi settled into 2A with the practiced economy of someone who has navigated airports and aircraft for so many years that the sequence of movements, bag in overhead, laptop retrieved, shoes eased off, seatbelt fastened, happened without conscious instruction. Her body simply doing what it knew, while her mind had already moved several steps ahead to the imaging files waiting on her hard drive. The Typ Vien Trung Grace, according to her name tag. A woman somewhere in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair, and the calm, unhurried competence of someone who had seen every possible configuration of human behavior at 30,000 feet and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it, came by with a warm towel and a glass of sparkling water, and something small happened. As she did it, she glanced at Naomi's name on her tablet, and for just a fraction of a second, barely long enough to register, her hand paused mid-reach. Not a hesitation born of doubt, but something more like recognition. The way you pause when you see a name you know from somewhere important, somewhere you didn't expect to encounter it in this particular moment and this particular place. Then the moment passed. Grace smiled with genuine warmth, asked if she could get Naomi anything else before boarding completed, and moved on without remark. Naomi pulled up the imaging files on her laptop. The dense, intricate geography of a 7-year-old's cervical spine laid bare in grayscale, and looked at them for a few minutes, turning the problem over in her mind, the way she always did in the early stage, not solving, yet just learning the shape of it, understanding where the damage was and where the healthy structure remained, and what the margins were between those two things. Then she closed the laptop and placed it carefully in the pocket of the seat in front of her. She was not going to work on this flight. She was going to sleep, or try to, because the most dangerous thing she could bring into that operating theater tomorrow evening was a brain running on 40 hours without rest, and she knew her own limitations with the same clinical precision she brought to everything else. She put her earbuds in, selected something without words, a Sadie piano piece she had listened to approximately 1,000 times, and that her nervous system now recognized as a signal to stand down, and she leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Iris was waiting. Derek Holloway had been a senior managing director at Crestline Capital for 11 years, which meant he had spent the better part of a decade operating in an environment where his opinion on any subject was sought, where his discomfort was treated as a scheduling problem to be solved by someone else, and where the distance between wanting something and having it had been worn down to nearly nothing by a continuous application of money status and the particular social lubricant of other powerful people agreeing with him. He was 54 years old, and he wore it in the particular way that wealthy men of a certain type tend to wear their 50s, not gracefully but heavily, with a kind of imperious solidity, as though the years had not so much aged him as compressed him into a denser version of what he had always been. He moved through JFK's International Terminal that morning, the way he moved through most spaces slightly ahead of his own momentum, as though the floor owed him something for the privilege of being walked on. His platinum blonde hair, more platinum than blonde these days, though he did not spend much time thinking about the distinction, was combed back from his forehead with the geometric precision of a man whose personal grooming was handled with the same detail orientation he applied to quarterly earnings. His suit was the color of pale stone, bespoke and even slightly rumpled from the car service that had arrived 18 minutes late, a fact that had cost his driver a terse 3-sentence message that Derek had composed and sent in the elevator down from his Upper East Side apartment without breaking stride. He had drunk 2 glasses of scotch in the Platinum Members Lounge. Not because he was nervous. Derek Holloway was not as a rule nervous about things, but because it was there, and because the lounge was crowded with the particular subspecies of business traveler that Derek found exhausting. People who wanted to network, who recognized him and hovered at the edge of his peripheral vision, hoping to be invited into conversation, who needed things from him in a way that he could smell like cheap cologne. The scotch was less a drink and more a social boundary, a way of occupying his hands and signaling to anyone considering an approach that his attention was already elsewhere. He boarded early, as he always did, because early boarding was one of the small but non-negotiable perquisites of his status, and he walked down the jet bridge with his leather carry-on in one hand and his boarding pass pulled up on his phone in the other, already composing in his mind the opening of the 9 o'clock call he needed to make to the Zurich office once they were airborne. He stepped into the first-class cabin, paused at the entrance for a moment to let his eyes adjust from the jet bridge fluorescence to the warmer, more considered lighting of the premium space, and then looked down at his boarding pass. Seat 2B. His gaze moved from the number on his phone to the row numbers on the overhead panels, found row 2, and then traveled naturally to the window seat 2A, where a woman was sitting with her eyes closed, earbuds in her head resting lightly against the oval window. The thing that happened in Derek Holloway's mind in that moment was not in his own internal narration what it actually was. He would not have described it to himself as prejudice, because Derek Holloway did not think of himself as a prejudiced man. He had black colleagues. He had attended a diversity seminar 3 years ago that he had found reasonably informative, and he was in his considered self-assessment, a person who evaluated others on the basis of their merits and their results. What he would have said if pressed was that there was something that didn't fit some low-frequency wrongness of arrangement, like a painting hung slightly crooked on a wall, not offensive, not dramatic, just subtly, persistently off. The first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight operated in Derek's private taxonomy, according to certain understandings, and one of those understandings, nowhere written and therefore impossible to explicitly defend, was about who occupied these particular seats and what that occupation meant about who they were. The woman in 2A was black younger than him, by what he guessed was 15 years, dressed simply in a cashmere sweater and dark jeans. She was not, in the narrow and specific vocabulary of Derek's expectations, the type. This assessment happened in under 2 seconds, and below the level of his conscious reasoning, which was why he would spend the next 20 minutes absolutely convinced that his objection was about something else entirely. He stood at the end of the row for a moment, carry-on in hand, looking at her. She didn't open her eyes, didn't shift, didn't perform the small social acknowledgement of someone who senses they are being observed and responds with appropriate awareness. She simply continued to exist in 2A in the same way the seat itself existed completely without apology, without reference to his presence whatsoever. Derek placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, and as he did, he moved the leather duffel that was already there, Naomi's, to one side, with a carelessness that was not quite aggressive, but was not careful either. The gesture of a man who was accustomed to making room for himself in whatever space he occupied, and who did not particularly notice or care what had to shift to accommodate that. Then he reached forward and tapped the headrest of 2A with 2 fingers sharply enough that there could be no mistaking it for an accident. Naomi opened her eyes. She took in the situation in the way she took in most situations comprehensively, and without hurry, her gaze moving from the man standing over her to the overhead bin where her bag had been rearranged, and then back to his face. And in the few seconds of that assessment, she read him with the accuracy of long practice, the set of his jaw, the placement of his hand on the headrest, the particular quality of expectation in his expression, the way he was looking at her, not with curiosity, but with the flat, settled certainty of someone who had already decided what the answer was and was simply waiting for her body to catch up to his conclusion. She had seen this before. She had seen versions of this in hospital hallways, in funding meetings, in the faculty lounge of the medical school where she'd done her residency, in taxicabs and boardrooms, and first-class cabins, and every other category of place where her presence defied someone's unspoken expectations. She knew it the way she knew the anatomy of the cervical spine, not because she had read about it in a book, but because she had spent decades navigating it with her own body. The tiredness that moved through her in that moment was not the tiredness of today, not the 4 a.m. alarm and the sleepless night before it, and the weight of the case waiting for her in London. It was older than that. It was the tiredness of a woman who has spent 41 years being required to prove things about herself that nobody asks a man in a pale stone suit to prove, and who has done that proving anyway, consistently, and without visible complaint, because the alternative was to let the people who needed her to be less than she was win a victory they had not earned. She thought briefly and very specifically about Iris, 7 years old somewhere in a London hospital right now, and somewhere in the constellation of possibilities that existed between this morning and tomorrow evening was one in which Naomi arrived rested and focused, and in full command of every skill she had spent 20 years developing, and one in which she didn't. She pulled one earbud out, looked at the man standing over her seat, and waited. Derek Holloway smiled the smile of someone who has been waiting for acknowledgement and has finally received it. I think he said with the slow, deliberate enunciation of a man explaining something to someone he has already decided doesn't understand quickly, there's been some kind of mix-up. Naomi looked at him for a moment, not with hostility, not with the particular performance of patience that people sometimes mistake for weakness. Just looked the way she looked at a scan before she began to read it, taking in the full picture before deciding where to focus. "There's no mix-up," she said, her voice carrying the even, unhurried quality of someone who is used to being the calmest person in complicated rooms. "I'm in 2A. It's my seat." Derek's smile didn't disappear so much as it reorganized itself into something slightly less warm and slightly more certain. "Right. So..." He gestured vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft, a hand movement that managed to encompass economy, premium, economy, and everything that was not here in one fluid dismissive arc. "Main cabin's back that way. Happens more than you'd think with the boarding groups." She did not reach for her phone to show him the boarding pass. She did not shift in her seat or sit up straighter or do any of the small physical things that signal a person preparing to make their case. She simply looked at him with the same steady, unhurried attention as before and said, "I know where the main cabin is. I'm not in it." And here was the thing about Derek Holloway. The thing that would matter a great deal in the next 20 minutes. He was not accustomed to being told a second time. In his professional life, a first correction was a misunderstanding. A second was an obstacle, and an obstacle was something to be removed. He didn't experience it as escalation. He experienced it as problem-solving. "Look," he said, his tone dropping to something he probably thought of as reasonable and that landed somewhere considerably closer to condescending. "I've been flying this route for 6 years. I know how the boarding process works, and I know how the seating manifest gets mixed up when the boarding pass has my name on it," Naomi said, not interrupting exactly, but not letting the sentence finish either. "Seat 2A. Would you like to see it?" What happened in Derek's face at that offer was small but legible. A brief, involuntary tightening around the eyes, the expression of a man whose authority has just been quietly and very specifically declined to defer to. She wasn't being rude. That was the part he couldn't quite get hold of. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't gesturing dramatically. She wasn't performing indignation for the benefit of the surrounding passengers. She was just sitting in her seat and declining to pretend there was any reason she shouldn't be. Inside her own chest, in a place she had learned to keep very separate from her external register, the old familiar exhaustion moved through her like a current. Not the exhaustion of this morning or this argument, but the accumulated weight of every version of this conversation she'd had over the course of a lifetime. Every room where she'd had to prove her right to be in it before anyone would discuss why she was there. She felt it, recognized it, and then she thought of Iris again, the imaging on her laptop, the particular pattern of the fracture. The 7-year-old who didn't know yet whether she would ever walk across a room under her own power, and the thought functioned the way it was supposed to function, like a hand on her shoulder, like her mother's voice. "You know who you are. Don't let him use your energy for this." She held on to that, and she held on to her stillness. And she waited. Derek straightened slightly, the way people do when they've decided to move from informal to official. I'll tell you what he said, and the words had the clipped boardroom management quality of a man who has decided to involve the proper channels. "We'll just get a flight attendant over here and sort this out properly. I'm sure it'll only take a moment." He said this last part with the certainty of someone who has never once been the one who ended up being wrong when a flight attendant sorted things out, and the certainty was so complete and so unexamined that it was almost in its way impressive. He lifted his hand and signaled down the aisle, not a polite raise of the arm, but a snap of the fingers, sharp and summoning, and Naomi turned back toward the window because there was nothing further to be said. And the sky beyond the glass was an early morning gray that she found in this particular moment considerably more interesting than Derek Holloway's face. Jamie Osei was 26 years old and 7 months into her career as a flight attendant, which was long enough to have developed a functional sense of when a situation was going to be simple and when it wasn't. and the moment she saw the tall man in the pale stone suit snapping his fingers down the aisle of the first-class cabin with that particular expression on his face, the expression of someone who expects the problem to be the other person, she felt the specific quality of dread that comes from knowing you are about to be placed between two immovable things. She walked up the aisle with the customer service composure she'd been trained to maintain under pressure, her hands clasped in front of her, and by the time she reached row 2, she had already assessed the situation, in the way that young flight attendants learn to assess things fast. The man standing was large and expensive and visibly certain of himself. The woman seated was still and watchful, and wearing the expression of someone who has decided to let events unfold without her assistance. "Good morning, sir," Jamie said, the smile automatic and professional. "Is there something I can help with?" "Yes," Derek said, the word coming out with the precise, clipped assurance of someone filing a formal complaint rather than making a request. "There's been an error with the seating assignment." This passenger, he indicated Naomi with a gesture that managed not to be pointing, while still being unmistakably pointing, is in my row. "I'd like you to check her boarding pass and get her sorted into the correct seat." Jamie turned to Naomi, and something in the way Naomi was already holding her phone out calmly without annoyance with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this before, told Jamie everything she needed to know before she even looked at the screen. She looked anyway. Naomi Reeves. First class. Seat 2, A, Flight 94. Sir Jamie said carefully, turning back to Derek with the tone of someone delivering news they expect to be contested. "The passenger in 2A is correctly assigned." "Her ticket is—" "That's not possible," Derek said, not loudly, but with a finality that was designed to end the conversation, his voice carrying the flat, unequivocal quality of someone who has decided that the other side of this exchange is simply mistaken and needs to be corrected rather than heard. "I specifically requested this row. I am a Platinum Apex member with Atlantic, and I have been flying this route twice a month for 6 years, and there has never been." Sir Jamie tried again, her voice staying even through considerable effort. "Your seat is 2B, which is right here on the aisle." "I know where 2B is," Derek said, and now the volume had risen just enough, half a register, just enough to travel through the quiet of the cabin and reach the ears of the other passengers in the front rows without quite crossing the threshold of what could be formally described as shouting. "What I am telling you is that the system has made an error, and what I would like you to do is correct that error so that we can push back on time. Now, is that something you're able to manage? Or do I need to speak to someone more senior?" The question landed on Jamie like a physical weight, and she felt the particular pressure of it, the pressure of youth, of inexperience, of being 26 and 7 months into a job she needed, facing a man of 54 with platinum hair and a bespoke suit and absolute confidence in his own authority. She looked at Naomi, which was a mistake, because Derek noticed her looking, and it gave him something. "She's not going to help you," Derek said, and the shift in his voice in that moment was subtle but audible, a slight change in temperature, a hardening at the edges that turned what might have been impatience into something closer to contempt. "The bottom line is very simple. I paid full fare for this row. I have been a loyal customer of this airline for 6 years, and I am not going to sit for 9 hours next to—" He stopped, reorganized, started again. "There is a manifest issue. I would like it resolved. If you're unable to do that, I'd like to speak with whoever is in charge of this cabin." In the row across the aisle seat, 2D, a man named Walter Ashby had spent the first 5 minutes of this exchange with his copy of the Financial Times, raised at the precise angle required to read it, and had spent approximately none of those 5 minutes actually reading it. Walter was 67 years old, a retired appellate court judge who had presided over cases in 3 different jurisdictions over a 40-year career. and he had developed over those 40 years an extremely refined sensitivity to the particular quality of argument that presents itself as reasonable while being at its structural core something else entirely. He recognized the architecture of what Derek was doing, the careful avoidance of the direct statement, the reliance on implication, the manufacture of procedural grievance as cover for something that had nothing to do with procedure. And it produced in him the same sensation it had always produced in his courtroom. A very specific, very cold kind of patience. He lowered the newspaper 1 inch and looked at Derek Holloway over the top of it. Derek did not look back. Naomi, for her part, was looking out the window at the tarmac, and what was in her mind was not anger. Anger would come later. Maybe in a hotel room in London, when all of this was over, and she had the privacy to feel whatever she needed to feel, but something more like a clear, narrow focus on the distance between this moment and the moment she needed to reach, which was an operating table at Great Ormond Street Hospital sometime tomorrow evening, and every minute of the flight that was not airborne was a minute that did not exist in the recovery timeline she was already building in her head for Iris. She pressed her thumbnail lightly against the face of her watch and made a private note of the time. "I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge of this cabin as well," Derek said, again, louder now, officially loud, a volume that was no longer in any way deniable as a cabin disturbance. "And I'd like it to happen before we push back from the gate, please." Jamie turned and walked toward the galley with the careful, controlled speed of someone trying to look calm while moving as fast as possible, and the cabin of Flight 94 held its collective breath in the way that crowds always hold their breath when they know something is coming that cannot be unsaid. Grace Adeyemi had been flying for 27 years, which meant she had been a flight attendant for longer than Jamie Osei had been alive, and she had reached the point in her career where she could read a cabin disturbance from the change in air pressure alone, not literally, but close enough that the distinction didn't much matter in practice. She had heard Derek's voice from behind the galley curtain, and had known before she pulled it aside what she was going to find: a large, certain man and an unfair situation, and a younger colleague in the middle of it, trying to hold something together with politeness and professionalism alone. She stepped out into the aisle and walked to row 2 with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who does not need to announce themselves because they will be noticed when they arrive, and she arrived, and she was. Derek saw her a white woman, silver-streaked hair, the additional service stripe on the cuff that indicated seniority, and something in his posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, a slight relaxation of the shoulders, a recalibration of tone toward what he apparently assessed as common ground. He spoke to her with a different register than he had used with Jamie collegial, almost the voice of someone who believes they have finally found the adult in the room. "Thank you," Derek said, and the gratitude was real in its way, though what he was grateful for was the arrival of someone he believed would see things as he saw them. "I've been trying to explain to your colleague that there's been a seating error that needs to be corrected before we push back. I'm not trying to cause difficulty. I just need this handled properly, and I don't think I've reviewed the situation," Grace said, and the 3 words landed with such complete quiet finality that Derek's sentence simply stopped existing, the way a small fire stops existing when you cover it. She glanced at the tablet in her hand, then at Naomi, then at Derek, and her expression carried not judgment, but an absolute immovable clarity that was in some ways more difficult to argue with than anger would have been. "Dr. Reeves holds a valid, purchased first-class ticket for seat 2A. There is no error in the manifest." Derek's collegial tone evaporated. "There clearly is an error." He said the word clearly, carrying the particular weight that people give to words when they are using them to mean you are wrong, and I am telling you so in the most efficient possible way. I specifically requested. "Specific seat requests are preferences, not guarantees," Grace said, and she said it without apology and without edge, simply as a fact being stated because it was a fact. "Your seat is 2B. That seat is available and ready for you right now." I'd encourage you to take it so we can complete boarding and depart on time." And here was the moment that Derek Holloway, had he been a different person, might have recognized for what it was, a door offered politely and without fanfare, through which he could pass and sit down and let the morning continue its normal course. The door was right there. Grace was holding it open with both hands. He looked at it, and he looked at Naomi, sitting in 2A without any visible awareness of or concern for his presence, and he made his choice. "I want to speak to the captain," Derek said, his voice dropping to something quieter and therefore more deliberate. Each word placed carefully like items being set on a table before a negotiation. "The captain has final authority over the passenger manifest. Go get the captain and let him sort this out, because I am not sitting down until this woman is moved." Grace looked at him for one more moment, the measured, unreadable look of a woman filing something away for later, and then she said, "I'll inform the captain," turned and walked back toward the galley and the cockpit door, with her hands folded in front of her, and her face giving nothing away at all. Captain Raymond Okafor was 58 years old and had been flying commercial aircraft for 31 years, the last 9 of which had been transatlantic routes on wide-body jets that carried between 200 and 400 people at a time across the North Atlantic, which meant that, in the aggregate, he had been personally responsible for the safe delivery of somewhere in the region of 4 million human beings from one side of the ocean to the other. He did not think about this particular statistic very often because it was not a useful thing to think about. What was useful was the checklist, the instruments, the conversation with the first officer, the weather report, the pre-departure sequence, but it was available to him as a kind of background fact about the shape of his life, the way that long experience tends to become not a thing you reference, but simply a thing you are. He was working through the pre-departure checklist with his first officer, a capable and quiet man named Torres, who had been flying with Okafor for 3 years, when the knock at the cockpit door came Grace's specific pattern, 3 short and 1 long, which told him before he picked up the handset that it was something worth stopping for. He listened to Grace's summary with the handset pressed to his ear and the checklist tablet resting on his knee, and when she finished he asked only one question. "Is the passenger in 2A creating a disturbance?" "None at all," Captain Grace said. "She's been completely calm throughout," Okafor said. "Stand by," and set down the handset and pulled up the passenger manifest on the flight deck display, scrolling to row 2. He tapped the entry for seat 2, A. Reeves Naomi. "Doctor." There was a notation attached to the entry, a priority flag coded amber, the kind that the airline's executive dispatch team attached to bookings that came through unusual channels with unusual urgency. He tapped it, and it expanded into a full-note emergency medical travel seat, secured by direct contact from the office of Elliott Voss Bookings, made at 11:47 p.m., 3 nights prior, full first-class fare paid by direct transfer. The note included a brief summary of the reason for travel, and Okafor read it once and then sat with it for a moment. He opened the desk drawer to his left and took out a small photograph that he had kept there for 9 years, since his first long-haul command, and looked at it. The photograph was of a little girl, 7 or 8 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, laughing at something off camera. His granddaughter Adayeze, taken 3 summers ago at a birthday party in Lagos. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she was in Okafor's private and unironic assessment, the best thing that existed in the world. He looked at the photo for a few seconds, then put it back in the drawer. Then he looked at Torres and said, "You have the checklist. I'll be back in 4 minutes," unbuckled his harness, straightened his jacket, and stood up. He did not rush. There was no version of what was about to happen that required him to rush, and rushing would have changed the quality of his arrival from what he intended it to be, which was the arrival of someone who already knows exactly how this ends and wants to make sure everyone else has the chance to understand it before it does. He opened the cockpit door and walked into the cabin. By the time Captain Okafor appeared at the front of the first-class cabin, Derek Holloway had been standing in the aisle for 11 minutes, and the standing had done something to him that he did not recognize as what it was. It had committed him. Every additional minute he had spent upright, demanding, insisting, had added weight to the position he'd taken, and the weight made it harder to move. Not impossible, but harder. The way a stone becomes harder to lift. The longer you've been standing next to it, telling people how heavy it is. He had, in those 11 minutes, said things that he would not, in the warm and retrospective safety of a different context, have chosen to say. He had told Jamie that her inability to handle a straightforward administrative error reflected poorly on her training. He had told Grace that he would be filing a formal complaint that would reach the VP level of customer relations before this aircraft lands. He had stated loudly enough for the passengers in the first 3 rows of premium economy to hear through the dividing curtain that he had never in 15 years of premium travel been expected to justify his presence in a first-class cabin to anyone. And the statement had a meaning that went well beyond its literal content, and every person within earshot understood that meaning and the understanding had settled over the cabin like a change in weather. Walter Ashby had at some point in the last 4 minutes set his newspaper down entirely. He was not performing attentiveness. He simply was not going to pretend to read while this was happening. He looked at Derek with the calm, assessing patience of a man who had spent 40 years watching people argue and had developed in that time a very precise sense of which arguments were about what they claimed to be about, and which were about something else dressed in borrowed clothes. In the row behind him, the young couple who had been quietly recording on their phones continued to record. They had not announced this. They had not drawn attention to themselves. They simply had their phones resting on the armrests at angles that any reasonable person looking at them would have recognized, and Derek Holloway was the only person in the cabin who had not looked. Naomi had not looked either, but for a different reason. She was not recording. Derek was not watching other people record him, was not tracking the shifting mood of the cabin or calculating the degree to which his position was becoming untenable. She was looking out of the window at a fuel truck making slow progress across the tarmac, and she was thinking about the C1 to C2 junction of a 7-year-old spine, and she was thinking about her mother, and she was thinking about what it costs to spend your energy on something that doesn't deserve it, and she was choosing actively, consciously, with the full weight of her experience not to. Derek heard the cockpit door before he saw it open, that particular mechanical sound, the release of the pressurized seal, and turned toward the front of the cabin with the expression of a man who has been waiting for reinforcements and believes they have arrived. He saw the captain step out, and for a fraction of a second, so brief it was nearly invisible, something complicated moved across Derek's face. He covered it immediately, smoothed his jacket, and pulled himself up to his full height. "Captain," he said, stepping forward into the aisle with the confident stride of someone moving to meet an equal, his hand coming up for the handshake that he was absolutely certain was coming. "I'm glad you came out. I'm Derek Holloway, Managing Director at Crestline Capital." Captain Okafor walked past him. Not around him, not with an apologetic redirect past him, the way you walk past a piece of furniture that is not in the right place, but that you'll deal with in a moment, moving with complete unhurried purpose down the aisle to row 2, where he stopped beside seat 2A and looked at the woman sitting there. Derek stood with his hand still slightly extended. The handshake, unreturned the introduction, unacknowledged, and the expression on his face cycled through several configurations before settling on something that it would be generous to call confused. "Doctor," Reeves Okafor said, and his voice in the quiet cabin was low and steady, and carried the particular kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself because it already fills the room. "I'm Captain Okafor. I want to apologize for what you've experienced since boarding." "Are you all right?" Naomi turned from the window and looked at him fully for the first time since she'd sat down in this seat with the calm, clear attention of someone who has been waiting for something real to happen and has just finally seen it. "I'm fine, Captain," she said. "I'd very much like to get in the air." The corner of Okafor's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who agrees completely but has one thing to handle first. He turned slowly and with no particular urgency to face Derek Holloway. Derek had not moved from his position in the aisle. He was standing with his arms at his sides now, the handshake gesture long abandoned, and his face had gone through several more configurations and landed on something that wanted to be authority, but was underneath its surface beginning to show the first hairline fractures of a man who is starting to sense that the architecture of his position may not be as solid as he had assumed. "You wanted to speak to me?" Okafor said. It was not a question. "Yes," Derek said, and the yes had to be rebuilt from scratch. He could hear it himself, could hear that it was not the same. Yes, he would have produced 5 minutes ago, and he pushed through that awareness and kept going because stopping now was not an option he could locate. "Yes, there's been a consistent failure from your cabin crew to address a legitimate concern about the seating manifest, and I'd like—" "What is your concern about the manifest?" Okafor asked, his voice unchanged, quiet, even genuinely curious in the way that a surgeon is genuinely curious when a patient describes a symptom that tells them something important. Derek straightened. "My concern is that the passenger in seat 2A does not have a legitimately purchased first-class ticket, and I have been told repeatedly that she does, and I don't believe." "She does," Okafor said. "I've reviewed it myself." He paused just long enough. "Is that your only concern?" The question sat in the cabin air, and what it really meant, what everyone in earshot understood it to mean, was something that Derek could not answer honestly without ending any possibility of the outcome he wanted. And he knew it, and Okafor knew he knew it. And the knowing of the knowing was its own kind of verdict. Walter Ashby looked at his newspaper and did not pick it up. "Mr. Holloway," Captain Okafor said, and the way he said the name without title, without warmth, without the collegial affectation of one professional addressing another, carried a precision to it that cut through every layer Derek had wrapped around himself over the past 14 minutes. And, for the first time since he had tapped the headrest of seat 2, Derek Holloway was standing in a room where his name meant nothing more than his name. "I have reviewed the passenger manifest for this flight," Okafor continued. His voice pitched to carry through the cabin at a volume that was the exact opposite of secretive, not theatrical, not performative, just clear the way. Important information should be clear, and I have reviewed the priority notation attached to the booking for seat 2A. I'm going to share some of what that notation contains, because I believe it is relevant to the situation that has caused this delay. Derek opened his mouth. Okafor's gaze moved to him brief and absolute, and Derek closed it. 2 rows back, the young woman who had been recording touched her partner's arm without looking away from the front of the cabin. Walter Ashby placed his folded newspaper on the empty seat beside him as though he was making room for what was coming. Jamie, standing near the galley curtain, had her hands clasped very tightly in front of her, and was looking at the captain with an expression that, had she been able to see it on her own face, she would have recognized as the expression of someone watching. Something become right after a long period of being very wrong. Naomi sat with her hands in her lap and looked at Captain Okafor, and in her chest the slow, steady engine of her composure ran on because she had not started this, and she had nothing to prove, and she was going to be on an operating table in London in approximately 19 hours. And every bit of herself that she could preserve between now and then was a bit of herself she could give to Iris. Mr. Holloway Okafor said again, pulling a slow breath. "I understand you've been with Crestline Capital for 11 years, Senior Managing Director." Derek blinked. The shift in subject matter caught him off balance. "That's correct," he said carefully, the corporate identity reasserting itself like a reflex. "I report directly to—" "You report within an organization chaired by Elliot Voss." Okafor said, and the name landed in the cabin with a weight that was out of proportion to its 2 syllables, because names like Elliot Voss carry weight, even when they're spoken quietly, in the way that very large objects cast shadows, even in dim light. Derek's expression shifted a tiny involuntary movement in the region of his eyes, something that was not quite recognition and not quite alarm, but was somewhere in the space between them, where the first real understanding begins to form. 3 days ago, Okafor said, and his voice was steady, as the Horizon line, Mr. Voss's personal office contacted Atlantic Airways Executive Dispatch. The call came in at 11:47 in the evening. He let the hour sit there for a moment because 11:47 in the evening is the hour of emergencies and not of administrative requests, and everyone in the cabin felt the weight of that. They needed a first-class seat secured on this specific flight. They paid $9,200 for it by direct transfer, and they needed it within the hour. The cabin was so quiet that when the fuel truck outside moved again across the tarmac, the faint mechanical rumble of its engine was briefly audible through the oval windows, and then it passed, and the quiet returned. And in that quiet, Captain Okafor continued. "Mr. Voss's granddaughter," he said, "is 7 years old. Her name is Iris. 3 days ago, she was involved in an accident in Surrey, a fall from a horse, and she sustained a serious injury to her cervical spine." He paused, and the pause had the quality of someone giving the room time to understand what cervical spine means when it applies to a 7-year-old, the specific geography of hope and fear that those 2 words contain. The injury is complex. There is compression of the spinal cord. 2 hospitals in London reviewed her case and both agreed that the surgical intervention required was beyond what their teams could safely perform. Derek had not moved. His carry-on was still in the overhead bin above seat 2B. His jacket was still perfect. His platinum hair was still immaculate, and all of it had become, in the last 45 seconds, somehow beside the point props on a stage where the play had changed around him without anyone telling him the new lines. Mr. Voss's office contacted 3 specialists internationally, Okafor said. All 3 of them independently, without consulting each other, gave the same name. He turned his head slightly toward seat 2. Not a dramatic gesture, not theatrical, simply the turn of a man indicating something true and important. Dr. Naomi Reeves, Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery at the Mayo Clinic, one of 8 surgeons in the world with the specific training to address the type of injury Iris has sustained, and the one that every person who reviewed this case agreed gave that child the best possible chance. The silence in the cabin had changed. It had begun as the silence of witnesses of people watching something play out between other people, and it had become the silence of understanding, the heavier, stiller quiet of people who are no longer watching from outside, but are inside the thing now, feeling the full dimension of it pressing against them from all directions. Derek's mouth had opened slightly. He was not speaking. He was simply open in the way that a sentence is open when you've started it and then lost the second half, Doctor. Reeves boarded this aircraft. Okafor said, his voice unchanged, steady, even carrying no particular emotion because the facts themselves were carrying everything that needed to be carried to fly 9 hours across the Atlantic on a matter of hours' notice because a 7-year-old child is lying in a hospital in London, and her grandfather, who runs the company where you have worked for 11 years, called an airline at midnight and paid $9,200 for a first-class seat because he needed the best possible surgeon to be rested and ready when that aircraft landed. He looked directly at Derek Holloway. That seat, he said, is seat 2A. What came next happened in stages. The way significant things often do not all at once, but in a sequence of realizations, each one unlocking the next, each one worse than the one before it. And Derek experienced all of them in the course of about 10 seconds while standing in the aisle of a transatlantic first-class cabin with approximately 40 people watching him understand the full architecture of what he had done. He had looked at a woman sitting quietly in her seat and decided in under 2 seconds and without a single piece of evidence that she didn't belong there. He had then spent the better part of 15 minutes loudly and publicly insisting that she be removed, escalating through every level of cabin staff, invoking his corporate title, threatening careers, and demanding the intervention of the person now standing in front of him. And the woman he had spent 15 minutes trying to remove was the only surgeon on Earth who might be able to give a 7-year-old girl her legs back, flying at the direct and desperate request of the man who controlled Derek's professional life. These facts did not arrive in Derek's consciousness as a sequence. They arrived simultaneously like a door opening into a room with no floor, and the sensation of the arrival was visible on his face in a way that could not be controlled or managed or reframed, because there was no reframe available, because some truths are the wrong shape to fit into any version of the story where you come out looking acceptable. The blood left his face. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a slow, unmistakable withdrawal like tide going out the red of a moment ago, replaced by something pale and mottled, the particular complexion of a man who is experiencing the physical reality of his own recklessness. His mouth opened and closed once, and then once more, and no sound came out. Naomi watched this happen, and her expression was not triumphant, and it was not vindicated, and it was not the face of someone tasting the sweetness of justice because she had not been fighting for justice, she had been trying to get on a flight. And what she felt watching Derek Holloway understand the thing he had done was nothing so simple as satisfaction. It was something older and quieter than that, the recognition of a pattern she had seen 1,000 times the moment when the assumptions that have been invisibly operating in a situation are finally made visible to the person who held them, and the making visible is not a victory so much as an exhausting necessary event that should not have needed to happen at all. She turned back to the window, and the tarmac was still there, and the sky was still gray, and somewhere under that sky a child was waiting, and that was the only thing that mattered now. 10 seconds passed. They passed slowly in the way that time passes in rooms where something important has just finished being said, and no one has yet found a way to speak normally again. In those 10 seconds, the following things happened. Jamie pressed her clasped hands against the front of her uniform jacket and breathed through her nose carefully. Walter Ashby looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a moment, and then looked at his folded newspaper and did not pick it up. The young woman 2 rows back lowered her phone 3 inches, then raised it again. The man in 4A, who had boarded quietly with a window seat and a paperback thriller and had been trying his best to read since the argument started, gave up entirely and placed the book face down on the tray table. Grace, visible at the edge of the galley curtain, watched Derek with the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had made her peace with it before it arrived. Derek Holloway stood in the aisle with his carry-on in the overhead bin above him, and the full weight of the last 15 minutes pressing down on his chest, and he said nothing because there was nothing available to him that would not make what had already happened worse. The calculus of his position had been performing itself in his mind rapidly and unbidden, and every direction he looked in the calculation produced the same result. There was no version of this story told by anyone who had witnessed it that ended with Derek Holloway coming out on the other side with anything intact. He had not assaulted anyone. He had not broken any law that would be easy to enumerate in a courtroom. But he had done something that the 40 people in this cabin had watched him do, and some of them had been recording it, and the thing he had done was as clear as language. He had looked at a woman and decided what she was worth before she had spoken a single word, and then he had spent 15 minutes trying to make the world conform to his decision. Naomi did not look at him. She was looking out the window, her profile turned away, and the absolute composure of her posture, the straight back, the folded hands, the absence of any physical signal of distress or triumph, was in that moment more eloquent than anything she could have said. She had known from the moment he tapped her headrest that this was not really about a seat. She had known it, and she had chosen not to engage with the thing it was actually about, because engaging with it would have cost her something she needed for Iris, and Derek Holloway was not worth the cost. She was still making that choice. She was still here. She was still going to London. Walter Ashby picked up his newspaper, opened it to a page he hadn't been on before, and began at last to read. Captain. Derek's voice came back in a register that was several floors lower than the one he'd been using for the past quarter hour, quieter, stripped of its boardroom certainty, constructed now with something close to care, as though he was handling the words gently, because he understood for the first time that they could break things. I genuinely didn't know. I had no idea who she was. I was stressed, the morning was difficult, and I made a set of assumptions that You did, Okafor said, and the two words had the quality of a door being quietly and completely closed. I would like to apologize, Derek said, and he turned toward seat 2, toward Naomi's back, toward her profile, toward the cashmere sweater and the careful composure and the 14 years of expertise and the midnight phone call and the mother's voice and everything else she was carrying that he had decided in 2 seconds in the aisle of a plane did not amount to a presence he needed to accommodate. Dr. Reeves, I sincerely, Mr. Holloway, Okafor said, and his voice was not unkind, which was in some ways worse than if it had been, because unkindness can be argued with, and this could not. The apology you're describing is the apology that's possible now that you know who Dr. Reeves is. That's not the same as the apology that would have been available to you 15 minutes ago before you knew when she was simply a woman sitting in a seat she had paid for. Those are 2 different things. He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. I understand, Derek said, and his voice had the hollow quality of understanding that comes too late to change the shape of what understanding is responding to. He turned to Naomi again. She had not moved. She had not turned. She was sitting in 2A with the same stillness she had maintained through the entire encounter and in the context of everything that had just been said. That stillness was not passivity. It was a statement as clear and complete as any she could have made in language about where he ranked among the things she had decided to spend herself on this morning. She reached up slowly and without drama and placed her earbuds back in. The gesture was not theatrical. It was simply accurate. Derek stood for another moment in the aisle, the overhead bin above him, the seat below it, empty and waiting. The captain beside him and the cabin full of silent witnesses around him. And the moment lasted long enough for him to understand that there was no version of staying on this aircraft that preserved anything he cared about preserving. The apology hadn't worked, because the apology was aimed at the wrong thing. He had apologized for not knowing who Naomi was. He had not apologized, could not locate in himself quite yet the precise angle of approach required to apologize for looking at her and deciding instantly and without evidence that she was less than him. That was the thing he had done. That was the thing the cabin had watched him do. And the captain was not looking at him with anger, was not looking at him with triumph or satisfaction, or any of the emotions that Derek would have known how to respond to, but with a kind of settled, clear-eyed recognition, as though he had seen this particular play performed many times before, and knew exactly how it ended. Mr. Holloway, Captain Raymond Okafor said, his voice carrying through the quiet of the first-class cabin with the same calm authority it had held throughout the same voice he would use to report turbulence or a change in altitude. The voice of someone who is simply describing what is true. You are no longer a passenger on this flight. Derek opened his mouth. Officers, Okafor said without raising his voice even slightly, are ready at the jet bridge. Please gather your carry-on. There is a particular quality to the silence of a crowd that has decided not to make a sound, and it is different from the silence of a crowd that has simply gone quiet, in the way that a held breath is different from a breath that has been exhaled. The silence that filled the first-class cabin of Atlantic Flight 94 as Derek Holloway reached up and pulled his carry-on from the overhead bin above seat 2B was that first kind of collective conscious, choosing not to speak, not to jeer, not to provide the catharsis of noise. Because the people who had watched this happen understood, in the way that people sometimes understand things all at once and without needing to discuss it, that the weight of what had just occurred required no amplification from them. 2 airport security officers were waiting at the top of the jet bridge as Okafor had said 2 uniformed figures whose presence there, which Derek had not registered when he boarded, had apparently been arranged sometime in the last few minutes with the quiet efficiency of people who know their part and play it without announcement. They did not grab him. They did not make a scene. They stood at the entrance to the jet bridge and waited with the patient professional neutrality of people who have walked this particular walk many times and understand that the walk itself is sufficient. Derek came up the aisle with his carry-on in one hand and his phone in the other, and he moved the way a person moves when they are trying to appear to be leaving of their own volition while being escorted out, which is a specific and recognizable way of moving that fools no one. He had straightened his jacket. He had smoothed his platinum hair back from his forehead with one quick pass of his hand. He was performing composure with every tool available to him, and the performance was technically adequate and completely unconvincing. He passed Walter Ashby's row, and Walter did not look up from his newspaper. This was not a slight. It was a verdict. The deliberateness of it, the old man's eyes on the page, the precise and total withholding of a glance that Derek would have been able to read something into, was the most complete dismissal available to a person without moving a muscle, and Walter delivered it with the mastery of someone who had spent decades knowing exactly what his attention was worth. He passed the row where the young couple had been recording. The woman's phone was down now. Had been down since Okafor spoke because there was nothing left to document. The important part was already captured, and she looked at Derek as he passed with an expression that was not hostile and not curious, but simply present the face of a witness who has witnessed and will remember. He did not look at her. He passed the galley curtain where Jamie was standing just inside the premium economy section, and for a fraction of a second their eyes met the young flight attendant and the man who had told her that her inability to manage a straightforward administrative error reflected poorly on her training, and Jamie held his gaze for exactly one count and then looked away, not because she felt the need to end the moment, but because he was no longer the most interesting thing in her field of vision. At the entrance to the jet bridge, Derek paused. Not for long, 2 or 3 seconds long enough to give the impression that the pause was chosen. He did not look back at row 2. He did not look at Naomi. The security officers moved one small step forward, a movement so subtle it barely qualified as movement, and Derek walked out of the aircraft and into the jet bridge, and the door closed behind him. In the cabin, for another long moment, no one said anything. Then Walter Ashby turned a page. Captain Okafor walked back through the first-class cabin at the same unhurried pace he had arrived with, and he stopped briefly beside seat 2A. He didn't crouch down. He didn't make it a significant moment. He simply paused in the way you pause when there is something worth acknowledging, and he said quietly enough that it was between them. "You should try to get some rest, Dr. Reeves. We'll have you in London on schedule." Naomi looked up at him, and the look she gave him was not gratitude in the performed effusive sense, not relief, not vindication, but something quieter and more durable, the look of one professional who has been treated with the respect they were already owed, acknowledging it without making it larger than it needs to be. "Thank you, Captain," she said. Okafor nodded once and continued to the front of the cabin and disappeared through the cockpit door, and the sound of the latch engaging was very small and very final. Outside the oval window, the fuel truck had finished its slow circuit of the tarmac. The boarding door was secured. Somewhere in the mechanical depths of the Boeing 777 systems were cycling through their sequences toward readiness, and in the premium economy section and economy sections beyond 231 people who would never know exactly what had happened in rows 2 through 4 were settling into their seats and pulling out their headphones and waiting for the same thing Naomi was waiting for. Movement, altitude, the relief of being somewhere different from where you were. She leaned her head back against the seat, put her earbuds in, and found the safety piece again right where she had left it, patient and unhurried, like a small room with a light already on, and she closed her eyes. And this time she slept. The Boeing 777 pushed back from the gate at 8:47 a.m., 43 minutes behind schedule, and by the time it reached its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet above the North Atlantic, the first-class cabin had settled into the particular private quiet of a long flight well underway. The small sounds of people arranging themselves for the hours ahead, the soft percussion of ice in glasses, the white noise of the engines underlying everything like a held note. Naomi slept with her head against the window and her hands loose in her lap, and she slept the way exhausted people sleep when they have finally, after a very long time, been given permission deeply and without movement, her breathing slow and even, the crease between her brows that had been there since 4 a.m. gradually releasing until her face had the uncomplicated openness of someone who has gone somewhere the world cannot reach. Grace moved through the cabin on quiet feet, attending to the other passengers, and each time she passed row 2, she did not pause and did not linger, because what the woman in 2A needed most right now was to be left alone. And Grace understood this with the instinct of someone who has spent 27 years learning how to read what people need. But she looked. Each time she passed, she looked the quick, comprehensive, assessing look that she had been doing for 27 years in varying directions, taking inventory of what was all right and what was not. Naomi was all right. For the moment, she was deeply, completely all right. Grace carried a passenger's sparkling water back to 4C, and as she walked, she allowed herself a thought she rarely indulged in during flights, which was a thought about herself rather than the people she was serving. She thought about a different flight 13 years ago on a different aircraft on a different route when she had been the junior flight attendant. And there had been a situation not entirely unlike this one. A passenger in a premium seat, another passenger who believed they did not belong there, and a flight attendant named Grace who had been 27 years old and 7 months into her career, and who had stood in the galley behind the curtain and listened to it happen and had not walked out. She had thought about that flight many times since then. She thought about it less often now than she used to because thinking about it did not change it. But she thought about it still, especially in moments like this one when she had walked out instead. The Atlantic passed below them, enormous and gray-green and indifferent. And in a hospital on the other side of it, a little girl named Iris was lying in a bed waiting for something she did not yet have words for the thing that would come to her. 7 months from now, in a physical therapy room in London, when she would take 3 steps between parallel bars and then look up and grin at her grandfather with all of the absolute uncomplicated triumph of someone who has found something she was afraid was lost. But that was not yet. That was on the other side of tonight. For now the engines ran on. Naomi slept. Grace moved through the cabin on quiet feet. And 38,000 feet below the ocean held its enormous ancient silence as it had always done and would always do, regardless of whatever small and large catastrophes played out above it. The security room in the lower level of Terminal 4 at JFK was a place designed for function rather than comfort, which was to say it was a place designed to make a person feel the full weight of their situation without the softening that comfort provides. The walls were cinder block, painted an institutional beige that had grayed over time. The fluorescent lights buzzed with the particular frequency that makes people either talk more than they should or less. There was a table, 4 chairs, and a wall-mounted camera in the upper corner that watched the room with the disinterested patience of a machine that does not sleep, and does not judge, and does not care. Derek Holloway sat in one of the chairs for 3 hours. He had not expected to sit in one of the chairs for 3 hours. He had expected, with the muscular reflex optimism of a man who has always had access to the mechanisms by which consequences get managed, that a phone call or two would clarify the situation, that the situation would be revealed to be something that could be framed differently, that someone with appropriate authority would appear and recognize him, and the recognition would function as a key. He had his phone. He made calls. He called his executive assistant, Philippa, who answered on the second ring, as she always did, and who told him in the careful, over-controlled voice of someone delivering information they expect to be received badly what the situation actually was. Atlantic Airways had canceled his existing return booking. His Platinum Apex membership, 15 years in the accumulation, the physical card alone, a source of a specific and particular satisfaction every time he withdrew it from his wallet, had been suspended pending review of the incident report filed by Captain Okafor. His passport number had been flagged in what Philippa described as a shared database for passenger disturbance incidents at the major carrier level, which meant that the other airlines she had tried to book him through had declined the transaction before it was completed. There was one available seat to London that could get him there in time for the meetings he needed to attend. It was on a budget carrier called Skybridge, departing from Newark at 3:10 a.m. It was a middle seat in the last row of economy. The fare was $340. Derek sat in the security room chair and stared at the gray-beige wall, and at some point in the second hour, he could not have said exactly when something began to happen that was unfamiliar and therefore difficult to name, which was that he started to think about what had happened without the layer of narrative he usually applied to events in his life. The layer that sorted things into categories of grievance and vindication and tactical error and strategic recalibration. He tried to apply it, and it kept slipping because the facts underneath it were a specific shape that the layer did not fit. He had looked at a woman and decided she did not belong in a first-class seat. He had made this decision before she had spoken a word, before she had moved, before she had given him any information at all beyond the information contained in her face and her clothing and her presence. And then he had spent 15 minutes trying to remove her from the seat and the mechanisms he had reached for his title, his loyalty status, the implicit social contract he believed existed between men of a certain standing, had not worked, and they had not worked. Not because of a technicality or a system error, but because the assumptions underneath them had been wrong, and the wrongness had been visible to everyone in the cabin, and some of them had recorded it. He sat with this for a while, and it did not feel good, and he did not arrive at any clean resolution, because clean resolution is not something that 3 hours in a cinderblock room tends to produce, and because some things cannot be resolved in 3 hours only begun. At 2:30 a.m., he took a car service to Newark Airport. He bought a bottle of water at a kiosk because he was thirsty, and the kiosk was there, and there was nowhere else to go. He boarded Skybridge Flight 441, the last to board, walking the full length of the aircraft to row 44, and he put his leather carry-on in the overhead bin in the slightly panicked way of someone who has not traveled without priority boarding in 15 years, and is no longer certain there will be space, and there almost wasn't, and a flight attendant had to help him find a slot 4 rows back, and the help was given with the flat professional competence of someone for whom this was simply a task, and not an act of recognition, which it wasn't because Derek Holloway in row 44 was simply a passenger, and that was all. The child in the seat to his left was perhaps 18 months old and was in the particular state of exhausted distress that produces crying that cannot be controlled or reasoned with. The man to his right fell asleep within minutes of takeoff and snored with the vigorous, uninhibited quality of someone with an entirely clear conscience. The seat in front of Derek reclined to its maximum position, which was not very far on Skybridge but was exactly far enough to reduce the already limited space between his knees and the tray table to something that required constant active management. 7 hours and 40 minutes. The child cried for 3 of them, then slept, then woke and cried again. Derek ate nothing. He could not sleep. He stared at the seatback screen, which offered a selection of films he had already seen or had no interest in seeing, and he stared at the clouds outside the window as the sky lightened toward dawn, and he thought without intending to about the woman who had crossed the same ocean 9 hours ahead of him in a leather first-class seat with the engines as white noise and someone to bring her water and the simple, profound gift of being allowed to rest. He landed at Gatwick at 11:40 a.m., 7 hours behind his original schedule. His suit was the same suit he had put on yesterday morning in his Upper East Side apartment, and it no longer looked like the suit it had been then. His platinum hair, unmanaged for 18 hours, had lost its geometric precision and said nothing in particular about anything. He took a taxi through morning London traffic, watching the city through the window, and when the taxi stopped outside the Crestline Capital London offices, he sat for an extra few seconds before getting out. Not because he was composing himself, it was too late for that, but because he was not yet ready for the next part, and the taxi was the last place before it. He got out, straightened his jacket, and walked inside. Great Ormond Street Hospital at night carries a specific kind of quiet that is different from the quiet of other buildings at night, denser in a way that is hard to articulate but impossible to miss once you've felt it. The quiet of a place where very important things are happening behind closed doors, where the ordinary proportions of importance have been rearranged, where a set of numbers on a monitor matters in a way that numbers almost never matter anywhere else. Naomi had been in operating theater 4 for 14 hours. She did not, in those 14 hours, think about the man on the airplane. She did not think about the cabin or the argument or the captain's announcement or Derek Holloway's face when the full picture assembled itself in front of him. She did not think about any of it because thinking about any of it would have required a portion of her attention, and her attention was not available for anything except what was in front of her. The microscope, the field, the instruments in her hands, and the 7-year-old child whose spine she was painstakingly, millimeter by millimeter, piece by piece, restoring toward the possibility of a different future than the one the last 4 days had been pointing toward. This was what 14 years looked like from the inside. Not heroism, not drama, just the long, sustained, almost mechanical application of everything she knew in the right order for as long as it needed to take without error and without rushing, because error and rushing were not options that existed in this room. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She had inherited steadiness from her mother in the same way she had inherited the quality of composure, and the thing underneath composure that was not coldness but precision. The ability to feel what needed to be felt and keep it somewhere separate from the work, because the work needed all of it. The work was the whole point. The surgical team around her moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had trained for this and were doing it well, and she was grateful for them, and she told them so in the small, specific ways available in an operating theater. A nod, a word. The particular quality of trust communicated when a surgeon holds out a hand for an instrument and does not look down, because the instrument will be there. At 6:43 in the morning, she stepped back from the table, looked at what the imaging was showing her, and felt in her chest the specific clear sensation she had been working toward for 14 hours. The compression relieved the cord, freed the structure, rebuilt to something that might. Would she believed? She was careful with believing, but she believed hold. She said a few words to the team. She looked at the clock. She walked out of the operating theater through the double doors and into the corridor and pulled off her surgical cap and stood still for a moment in the way that people stand still when they have been in motion for a very long time, and the stillness is a new country they are not yet fully oriented in. Elliot Voss was in the family waiting room at the end of the corridor. He was 63 years old and one of the most consequential financial figures in the world, and none of that was visible in the man sitting in the plastic chair outside Operating Theater 4. What was visible was a grandfather. The ruined suit, the tie somewhere on the floor. The eyes that had been red and dry and red again through the night. the hands clasped between his knees with the simple, helpless posture of someone who has run out of things to do and can only wait. He looked up when Naomi came through the doors, and he stood up fast, the urgency of it overcoming the stiffness of a night spent in a plastic chair, and he looked at her face, and he read it because faces like the one Naomi was wearing at that moment are not difficult to read if you are looking for the right thing. "The compression is relieved," Naomi said, and her voice was steady, as it always was, steadier than the rest of her because her voice had been trained to be. "Iris is stable. The spinal cord is decompressed and our preliminary checks on motor response are giving us good results." She held his eyes. "She will need months of rehabilitation. It will be hard work. But Mr. Voss," she paused just long enough, "she is going to walk again." Elliot Voss's knees went first. He sat down into the plastic chair heavily, one hand coming up to cover his face, and then the hand was not enough, and both hands were not enough, and he wept in the open, unguarded, entirely unself-conscious way that people weep when the thing they have been most afraid of turns out not to be the thing that happens. Not quiet crying, not the contained variety, but the full physical release of terror that has been held tightly for too long and has finally been given permission to stop. Naomi sat down in the chair beside him and waited. The way she always waited, present, quiet, without the performance of comfort that would have been inappropriate and intrusive, simply there, because being there was what was needed. After a while, the weeping slowed, and Voss straightened and wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at her with an expression that belonged to a man who has just understood something important about the scale of his own gratitude. "Whatever you need," he said, and his voice had the raw, scraped quality of someone who has used it in ways it was not designed for. "Whatever the department needs, whatever the research needs. Name it." "I want to see her wake up," Naomi said. "That's enough." Voss nodded, and for a moment they sat together in the corridor outside the operating theater. Two people who 12 hours ago had been strangers and were now connected by something that did not need a name. Then Voss said quietly, "My team told me there was a situation on the flight." Naomi looked at him. She was not going to pretend it hadn't happened, and she was not going to perform distress about it, and she was not going to use it as anything other than what it was, a thing that had happened, described accurately to a man who had asked. "One of your senior managing directors at Crestline," she said. "He took issue with my presence in the first-class cabin and spent approximately 15 minutes trying to have me removed. The captain handled it." Voss was very still. "His name," he said. "Holloway," Naomi said. "Derek Holloway." Voss absorbed this. He sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things that required decisions, not impulsively, not with the anger that was clearly there and clearly enormous, but with the controlled deliberateness of someone who has learned over a very long career the difference between reacting and deciding. Then he took his phone from his jacket pocket and made 2 brief calls, and Naomi heard the calls without listening to them, heard the names of people, the tone of short, exact instructions given clearly, and then Voss put the phone away and looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry that happened. I'm sorry it has happened in every room like that one that you've ever walked into." Naomi looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, and then she stood up because Iris was in the recovery room, and she needed to check on her. And there was a team debrief in 40 minutes, and she had been told that Dr. Webb had arranged for a room at a hospital apartment facility nearby where she could sleep before the evening follow-up, and all of these things needed to happen in order. She picked up her bag and she walked down the corridor toward the recovery ward, and the fluorescent lights above her were very bright and very steady, and she did not look back. The elevator to the executive floor of Crestline Capital's London offices moved too slowly. Derek Holloway noticed this because he was counting things in the involuntary, anxious way that the mind counts things when it cannot control anything else. The floor numbers illuminating one by one, the faint bell that accompanied each, the particular quality of his own reflection in the polished metal of the elevator door, which was not the reflection of the man who had stepped into an elevator in New York 24 hours ago, and was not quite the reflection of anyone else either. He had prepared on the taxi ride from Gatwick a version of events. He had rehearsed its shape, its emphases, its strategic omissions, the airline's unreasonable response to what was at its core a straightforward matter of customer expectations, the manifest confusion that had created an ambiguous situation, the stress of a delayed departure and a communication breakdown with cabin staff. He had built it the way he always built narratives that needed to be built from the materials available, shaped toward the outcome required, delivered with the kind of confidence that makes people reluctant to probe the seams. The elevator reached the executive floor. The door opened. He walked out. The boardroom at the end of the hall was where the merger preparation meetings had been scheduled, the room where he should have been sitting 18 hours ago, where the deal team from the other party would have been, where lawyers and analysts and the careful collaborative machinery of a major acquisition would have been moving through its sequence. He had rehearsed for those rooms. Those rooms were rooms he knew how to be in. He pushed open the heavy door and stopped. The boardroom was empty except for one person. Elliot Voss was sitting at the head of the conference table in a chair that had been placed at an angle not facing the door directly but turned slightly the way someone sits when they are not expecting to receive a guest but are prepared for one. He was 63 years old, and he had spent the night in a hospital corridor in the plastic chair outside an operating theater, and none of that had diminished him in any way that Derek could identify. If anything, the opposite was true, because the sleeplessness and the grief and the particular tempering that comes from a night spent on the edge of losing someone irreplaceable had burned away whatever was performative in the man and left only what was real, and what was real was formidable. He looked at Derek when Derek came in. He did not speak. He simply looked with the contained, very cold attention of someone who has already made every decision that needs to be made, and is now simply waiting for the conversation to catch up to the decisions. Derek crossed the room and sat down, the habit of professional confidence, operating below the level of conscious choice. And he opened his mouth, and the prepared narrative, the rehearsed one, the shaped one, the one with the strategic omissions, simply wasn't there. He looked at his own hands on the polished table, and he looked at Elliot Voss, and he said, "Because there was nothing else available, I need to explain what happened." "I know what happened," Voss said. His voice was entirely flat, the way very still water is flat, not calm, because calm implies an active quality, a choice, and this was something else, the absence of any warmth at all. "I have the captain's incident report." He placed a printed sheet on the table between them without sliding it across, just placed it at the precise midpoint so that Derek could read it if he chose to and could not pretend he didn't know it was there. "I spoke to Dr. Reeves, and I spent the night in a waiting room finding out whether my granddaughter was going to spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair because the surgical window was narrowing with every hour the aircraft sat on the ground." He stopped. He looked at Derek. Because of this. The prepared narrative was not simply gone. It had been replaced by nothing, which was the appropriate substitute. Derek sat with his hands on the table and felt the full dimensions of what he had done, pressing in from all directions, and for the first time since seat 2A, he could not manage the experience from a distance. "I didn't know," he said, and he said it not as a defense. He had abandoned defense, somewhere in the elevator, or maybe before that, maybe in the security room at JFK, but as the one true and irreducible fact available to him, the floor beneath everything else. "No," Voss said. "You didn't know who she was. That's accurate. But you knew who you thought she was. You decided that in the first 2 seconds before she had spoken one word to you. And everything that followed, every minute of that disturbance, every threat you made to those flight attendants, every minute that aircraft sat on the ground, came from that decision. Not from confusion about a boarding pass. Not from stress. from a decision you made about who a woman was based on nothing except what she looked like. He paused. And you made that decision? Voss continued, his voice never rising in the company of 40 witnesses. On an aircraft where people were recording, using my company's name to threaten people. I understand, Derek said. You understand now, Voss said. You understood differently 15 hours ago. He pulled a second sheet from the folder in front of him and placed it beside the first. Effective this morning, your employment with Crestline Capital is terminated for gross misconduct. The morality clause in your contract, which you signed 11 years ago, and which you have always known was there, has been activated. Your severance package is void. Your unvested stock is canceled. The pension provisions that required continued employment in good standing are no longer applicable. Derek looked at the 2 sheets of paper on the table between them. He thought about 20 years. He thought about the apartment, the car service, the Platinum Apex card, the golf club, the specific architecture of a life built around the assumption that certain things were stable. He did not argue. There was no argument available that he could respect himself for making, and somewhere in the night in row 44 over the Atlantic, or the security room at JFK, or the elevator. Just now he had arrived at a place where the self-respect available to him was a very small and specific kind, the kind that comes from not adding dishonesty to what has already been done. I know Voss said, reading something in Derek's silence, that you believe this is disproportionate, that you will eventually tell yourself a story in which you were punished for one bad morning by a man who was emotionally compromised by a family crisis. He did not say this with cruelty. He said it with the even clarity of someone describing a thing they have seen happen before and are not interested in watching again. If that story is more comfortable, you're welcome to it. But the report will follow you. The recording will follow you. Not because I'll send it to people, though I will speak to colleagues, but because these things have a way of following people now. He stood straightening the jacket he had not changed from the night before and picked up the folder. The meeting today has been rescheduled. Lily, my granddaughter Derek will need several months of intensive rehabilitation before she walks again. She will walk. Because Dr. Reeves flew through the night and stood in a surgical theater for 14 hours. He walked to the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back once, and the look was not contemptuous and not vindictive. It was simply final, the look of a man who has said what needed to be said and does not intend to add to it. She's going to be all right, Voss said, and it was unclear deliberately or not whether he was speaking about Iris or about Dr. Naomi Reeves or about some larger and unnamed thing, and then he walked out and his footsteps receded down the corridor, and Derek sat alone in the empty boardroom with the 2 sheets of paper and the leather carry-on, and the silence of a city that did not know and did not care what had happened to him, and began the long, unglamorous work of figuring out what came next. 20 minutes later, a junior HR assistant knocked quietly on the boardroom door, came in with the polite, careful manner of someone who has been briefed on the sensitivity of the situation, and handed Derek a single cardboard box. It was smaller than he expected. 20 years, it turned out, did not take up very much space. The morning light came through the window of Iris's recovery room in the slow, tentative way of London light in autumn, not flooding in but arriving as if checking first whether it was wanted, and then staying when it found the room quiet and the small figure in the bed beginning at last to stir. Naomi was standing near the door when it happened, when the little girl's fingers moved first, and then her eyes found her grandfather's face, which was right there beside the bed, because it had been right there beside the bed for the entire night, and would be there for as many nights as it needed to be. And the expression that moved across Iris's face when she found it, the slow, drowsy, absolute recognition of someone returning from a very long way away, was one of the most fundamental human expressions that exists, and it required nothing else to be complete. Voss did not speak. He took her hand in both of his, very carefully, and bowed his head over it, and Naomi looked at this for a moment, and then looked away because some things belong to the people they are happening to and do not need a witness. She checked the monitors with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom this is ordinary, and it was ordinary in the sense that it was the ordinary of her work. The thing she did, the reason she was standing in this particular room on this particular morning, and when she had seen everything she needed to see, she updated the chart and put the chart down, and looked once more at the small figure in the bed and the old man holding her hand, and she felt what she always felt at this moment. The particular private satisfaction that cannot be quantified or displayed or put in a paper or included in a funding application. The sensation of having done the thing you were built to do and having done it well enough. She picked up her bag and walked out into the corridor. Grace was there. She was in her civilian clothes, jeans, a jacket, a scarf, and she was standing outside the hospital entrance, having apparently simply appeared the way people appear when they have decided to do something and have not bothered to construct an elaborate reason for it. She looked at Naomi when Naomi came through the doors and said, "I looked up which hospital. I hope that's all right." "It's all right," Naomi said. "I just wanted to know she was okay," Grace said. "She's going to be fine." Grace nodded, and they stood for a moment in the morning light on the pavement outside Great Ormond Street Hospital. And then Grace said, "Do you want coffee?" And Naomi said yes. And they walked together down the street looking for a place that was open. Two women in a city that did not know their names, and the morning went on around them, and the city went about its business, and the story continued the way stories continue, after the significant part is over. Not with fanfare, not with a statement of what it all meant, but with coffee and a bit of cold air and whatever comes next. Derek Holloway's name appeared in a viral video that weekend, the cabin recording 94 seconds long, watched by 11 million people in 4 days. But he did not watch it himself, and by the time it peaked, he had already made the first of the phone calls that the following months would require. And the phone call had gone as he expected, and the one after that had gone similarly, and he was beginning to understand that some things cannot be managed from the other side, and can only be worked through from the front, which was a slow and uncomfortable education, but was possibly the only real one available to him. Iris took her first steps 6 months later, 3 of them between 2 parallel bars in a rehabilitation room at Great Ormond Street, laughing. She did not know the name of the woman who had flown through the night to give her that laugh back. She didn't need to. Naomi was in a different operating theater by then, her hands steady as they had always been doing it again.